Welcome back. This is then part 3 of our to-do app. So what we've done previously was to go through the UI and making sure that you know how the UI worked. And then we did the user class, which translates to the user table, and we did the to-do class that translates to the to-do table. So now we are ready to actually go and look at our database file. So we will be creating a class called to-do database. Now you can call this class whatever you want. That doesn't matter at all. So for this class, I'm going to start off right at the top with a static final to-do database. And I basically want to make sure that I'm working with a singleton here so that I get only one copy of the database back. And every time I try to open the database, I'm not creating a new instance of the database the whole time. So I'm going to call this instance. And I'm going to set this equal to to-do database, but I'm going to use a named constructor called initialize, or you can call it init, or whatever you want to call it. So let's have this one here. So I'm going to say to-do database underscore or dot underscore initialize. Okay, so by creating a named constructor here, then I need to specify the constructor that I want to use somewhere else, which means I cannot create an instance of this class outside of this. So when I call instance, I know it's already initialized. This instance, called instance, will actually have an object of this database for me, and I will not have another way of creating an instance of this database. Right, let's just create another field here at the top that will also be static, and I'm going to call this one will be the database. The database is nullable, and we will have a database there right from the start. Right, so let's just import this database. So this is coming from, and you can see there it comes from your SQLite package. So make sure that you import this one that says package SQLite ... Right, so this will essentially be a link to my database. Okay, so now we've got the instance at the top that will create an instance of or an object of this today or to-do database. And then we will have a static database field at the top, which we will initialize now. Okay, so the first function that we're going to use here inside of this to-do database will be to have a private function called create database. Now, in order to create this database, we're going to use a database that will be passed in. We will have a version number there, so we will say version, and then we will have this as an asynchronous function in order for us to create this database. So when we create the database, a database object, which will be the one that we have at the top, will be passed in, and we will actually be creating our database with a specific version number. Right, so the first thing I want to do then at the top of this function, create database, is I want to set up some field values. So for example, our username, or our user's username, because we've got a username in the to-do, there's a username, and we've got a username in the user field. So obviously, we will just be referring to the username field, and that type for this one will be the only type that will say text, primary key, and it must not be null. Okay, so that's the type for my user's username, and then also I will have a final text type. So for all the text types, and those all the strings that we're going to have in our database, we will have the type of text, not null. And then for all the Boolean types, so let's say bool type, we will have it as Boolean, not null. Okay, so that's just the data types that we will be referring to in the SQL database as soon as we start creating the table. Okay, so let's create our user table first. So in order to do the user table, we need to use await because it's a feature that it tries to create a new table. So we're going to say, go to the database and execute something. And now we need to execute some SQL query there. So just put your semicolon at the end. And what I want to do here is to place an enter there. Use 3 single quotes there, right at the start. And we will end it off with also 3 single quotes there. And you will remember that is a multi-line string basically. Okay, so we're going to start there at the top and we're going to create a new table. So we're going to say create table, and the table name will be, now you remember that we have our table names at the top. So it's user table and it's called to-do table. Okay, so in this case, it's just the user table we're creating. So I'm going to say, go to that value there, user table, and we can import that from the user class. Okay, or the user file. So that user table comes from this one at the top. It's user table. So that's the name of the table. So we say create table space. Make sure there's a space, $ user table. Then we have a space again, and we open it up with a bracket. Then go down to the next line, and let's close it right at the end. So this will be the table that we will be creating now. Okay, so for this user table, we will then have a $ again. And now we need to specify the field names. So if you go back to your user dot, you will see these are our field names. It's username and name. So we can just go to userfields.username, and that will return back username, and userfields.name will return back the name. Okay, so here we're going to refer to userfields.username, put a space, and then the type of that one. So the types we have declared there at the top, and the user field username should be the text primary key is not null. So I'm going to use that one as user type, or username type. Put a comma, and now we can specify the next column. So the next column, exactly the same. It's going to be userfields.name in this case, space, and the type for the name is just a normal text type. So I'm going to use text type there, and that's all we need to do. Okay, so by saving it now, we will be creating a new table called user table, and user table is referring to user there. So the table will be called user. The fields or the column names will be a username column that is of type text primary key not null. And there's a name column for the type text not null. Now let's do exactly the same thing for the second table that we want to create. So we'll create a second table, create a table. In this case, it will be to-do table. Now that won't be imported yet, so just use a control dot on it, and you're going to get in that to-do dot. Okay, and then instead of saying userfields.username, we will use to-do fields.username. Now, this username will just be normal string or normal text. So we will use the text type for this one. Then we will go to the next one, which will be to-do fields. So let's go with the title next. The title will also just be a normal text type. Then let's go to the next one, to-do fields. Let's go with done. Done will be a Boolean type. So we're going to use the Boolean type. So it will say Boolean not null. Put a comma again. To-do fields dot created. And that one will translate into a normal text type again. Right, and then we just want to add one thing in here still, and we want to refer to something as a foreign key. So which means that this username that we've got in this table called to-do table should actually exist in this one here that's got the user table with the username. So this username here is unique because we set it to text primary key not null, but that username becomes a foreign key in here, which means that we cannot have a username in this table that is not also already there. Okay, so let's set up the foreign key here. So I'm going to say foreign key, bracket set there, and we will say, well, for this to-do fields dot username will be a reference to the user table, and the column in the user table that we want to refer to is user fields dot username. Okay, so what am I saying here? I'm saying a foreign key in the to-do fields username, this one there, is a foreign key, and it references the user table's username. Okay, so it's a foreign key for the user table's username. Right, I hope that makes sense. So this is your create database. So the database will be passed in with the version, and we will be having these different types, text primary key not null, text not null, Boolean not null. We create the user table with those two fields, and we create the to-do table with all of those fields, and it's a foreign key. Okay, so for now, this one is done, and we can move on to the next function. Okay, so we've got create database, and now a very important other function that you must have when you're using a foreign key. Without this, your foreign key won't work. So you will need another future, and let's call this one onConfigure. And I'll show you where we're going to use this now. So for this onConfigure, it's going to use or accept a database there. And for this one, we will use asynchronous also. And for the onConfigure, you will need to call await database.execute, and you'll need to have the following string execute. So you're going to say pragma foreign keys equals, and then you need to have it as on. So in the onConfigure, that's just a very small function, but you need to execute this to say that pragma foreign keys equals on. Otherwise, you cannot use a foreign key in your to-do table. Right, so now we can at long last get to actually opening up the database. So let's go to future again. So we're going to have a future. This future will return back the database for me. So we're going to open up the database now, and let's call it init database, or you can call it open or whatever. And we will pass in the file name. What should we call this database? And we're going to have an asynchronous function there in order to do so. So we will pass in that file name. Right, so the first step that we will need to do in here is to get the database path that's on the phone. So for this specific app that we're creating, there's a database path. And to get it, you will call await get databases path. And that will get the path to your database where it will be saved on your phone. Then we're also going to use a final path, because this path to the database combined with your file name will actually be where your specific database will reside. So we're going to use the join function there, and we're going to be joining two specific values. So let's just use the control dot there, okay, and that is not actually helping me to do any import statement there. So the join function that we want to have there at the top, you will need to go and import. So we're going to have an import there at the top, and you want to go to the path dot file. So package path dot. So make sure that you import that file at the top, package path dot, and then a join should be working now. Okay, so there we've got the join, and you can see join actually joins the given path parts into a single path using the current platform separator. So for iOS, there's maybe a different separator than for Android, than for Mac, than for Windows. Okay, so we're joining the path there, and the path or the values that we want to join for this path will be firstly the database path, and then the second part will be this file name that we're passing through. So let's say the file name is todo.db, then it will be the whole database path / and then your file name. Okay, then we can return actually the database now by calling await, and we call open database, and we need to have a path. Now there's a bit more than just a path, so let's just put a comma there and save it. So if you look at the open database, there's a path, there's a version, there's an onConfigure, and you can see there's the onConfigure. We already did it. So we were just calling it here. There's on upgrade, there's on downgrade, there's single instance, read only, on open, on create, and so forth. So we will just be using a few of them. So the path we've set, the version number, well, if you start off, it will be version number 1. The on create there, I will actually just call that create database function that we did now. And you can see that if you hover over on create, it needs a function with database, int. And that's exactly what we've got here. We've got database, int inside of this on create. Database and a version. Okay, so that version will translate back into that one. Okay, so that's the create database. And then we can also have that on configure, and you need this on configure for this foreign key that we're using. And then we can just use that underscore on configure. And again, you can see if you hover, it needs to accept a database. And that's exactly what on configure is accepting there, is a database, and it fits in nicely here. Right, and that is how you will initialize your database. So it's using this create, and it's using the on configure, and that's why we did these two first, so that we can initialize the database and open it up. So now we are able to open the database. And once you open up the database the very first time, okay, it will use the file name and the database path to get the path. If the version number changes here, then you can go and call on upgrade. So let's say you want to do something else that will look maybe a lot similar to this create database. So when the version changes, you can use on upgrade there also, or on downgrade or whatever you want. Okay, so there are some other options that you can also use with the open database. But basically, when we call initdb and we pass in the file name, it will make a link to the database and open it up. It will not run this part every single time. It will only run it once if this is not set up yet. And then for every other time we run it, we will just get a link to the database and an open database to work with. Okay, so this part is opening up the database. So let's just add a feature to also close the database. So let's call this one close. And we will have it as async as well. Okay, so in order to close it now, we will just call final database equals await. And we will call instance dot. Now, we can call this database, but you can see there the database at the top we cannot actually call right now. So we will have another function now. So let's just call it database for now. And it will show an error. And then we will go to that database and we will close it. Okay, so in order to get back this database, so let's do this part quickly before we carry on. So we will be returning a future database where this database is nullable, and we will be getting back or using a getter for that database. Okay, so this database at the top, you can see is private. So we want to create a getter for that database. So we don't want to have this database, even though it's static, to be retrieved outside of this class directly. So we will say get the database just as a getter, and we're going to have the async there. Okay, so inside of this function then, we will call if that database is not equal to null, which means that we already have a connection to the database, then we will just return that database. So right at the start, you can see it's not been initialized there. We haven't given it a value. So right from the start, this one will definitely not run. But the else part is then, if it is equal to null, then we can initialize the database. So then I will go to database equals await, and we're going to call that init database of ours. So this one that we're running then to make sure that we initialize the database, which will open the database for us and so forth. Okay, so the file name there that we're going to pass through, you can name it whatever you want. In this case, I'm just going to call it todo.db for the database. And then when we're done, we return this database. Right, and then you can see your close function is then fine because we get an instance of the database and we close it. Okay, so then that will release all resources, and when it gets to this if statement again, you will see that it's equal to null, so it will initialize the database again. Okay, so this is if we call instance, because instance is an object of this class, and we call then database on it, then we will either get the database that already exists, or it will make a connection, opening up that database and make one new connection for us, and then it returns. Okay, so that's database. So we're going to use this one in order to open up our database. Right, so now at long last, we are done with all setting up the database and making sure that we get only one instance of the database at any one time. So it will be linked to this instance variable there at the top. Okay, so now we can start with the CRUD operation. So the create, the read, the update, and the delete. So let's start with the first one. So it's going to be a future, and we're going to get back a user here. And for this one, we could just going to create, or just call it create user. So if we want to create a new user, we want to pass in a user object. This will all be asynchronous functions, and it's going to be called create user. So let's say we want to just return back that user that we just created, but it depends on what you want to get back. So we're going to call create user. Again, we're going to get a connection to the database. So I'm going to say db equals await instance.database. So that will get me a connection to the database. If it's not null, we'll just return it. Otherwise, we create a new connection to the database. Then I'm going to call await, go to that database, which we know is not null because we're testing there for not null. So I'm just going to use the exclamation mark there. And I'm going to use the insert. Now, just be reminded there's a raw insert where you can specify your SQL query on your own. So if you rather go that route where you actually specify your SQL code, then you can use raw insert. But that's a lot more lines of code here, so I'm just going to go with the normal insert. And you can see it needs a table name and it needs values. So to create a new user, we will go to the user table. So remember, user table comes from the user at the top, so it's called user. Okay, so it's in the user table, and the values that I want to pass in there will be this user object dot, and you will remember that toJSON function that we created in the previous video. So for the user, if I want to send it to the database, I need to convert it to a JSON file or to a map, and that map will be sent through to the insert function. So if you hover over it, insert, you can see it's a table and the values is a map. So that's why we need that toJSON function. And then we can just return back this user that was passed in just to make sure that we've got something back. But look at the insert. It actually returns back an integer. So this method helps insert a map into the table and returns the ID of the last inserted row. So if you wanted rather to get that ID back here, then you can say int there and you can say return this whole await statement. Okay, but for us, we will just be returning back the user there. Okay, so it's creating a new user. Okay, so for CRUD, that's the C, create. Now let's see if we can read something back from the user or from the database. So it's going to be future, get back a new user because we're going to get the user from the database. Let's call it get user. And maybe if we want to get a specific user, we will just be passing in the username and then we will get back that user. So I'm going to use async again. And then for this get user, again, like all the rest, we will go and say db equals await instance dot database. That will get me an instance of the database. And now I can start working on the database. When we query the database, we will be getting back a list of maps. So I'm going to call this one final maps, or you can call it final JSONs or whatever, equals await. Go to that database, and I'm going to run a query. Right, let's end it off. So for the query, you will see that there's a few things that we can actually accept here. So if you hover over it, you can see it needs a table where you're going to query. You can pass in some columns. There's a where arguments, there's group by, there's having, there's order by, there's limit, and there's offset. So there's a lot of things that we can set here. So for this query, I'm going to query the user table. So remember, user table is then user. All right, so we're going to query the user table. The columns that we want, we also specified here. So there's user table, it's called user. The columns that we want to get back, we specified in this all fields for the user fields. So we can just go and say user fields dot all fields. So we want to query, and the columns we want to get back is all the columns that we specified there in this list. Okay, excellent so far. All right, so the user table, we want to get those columns. Where, so the where clause then is, if you hover over it, just a normal string where clause, which cannot be null, or which can be null, but in this case, we will have a value there. And what we want to query there is to go to user fields dot username. So we want to look at the username field or the username column. So where the username column or the field is equal to something. So in this case, we could have said here username. So that's the where clause, where the username column contains this username. That's the record that we want to get back. But if you do it like this, there's always a chance that somebody can use this to their advantage and actually do some SQL injection there. So in order to get past that, there's also where arguments, which is just a list of arguments. Okay, so in this case, we'll just have a list there, and we will have the username field there. Okay, so basically what's happening is we're saying where the username is equal to this username passed in. So the question mark will be replaced by the first. If I have an and here, for example, and then you can have something else here with another question mark, then you can just go and put the second value comma separated. Okay, but in our case, we only have one there, so that's fine. So we will go and do a query on the user table, getting back all the columns where the username is equal to this username that was passed in. Right, so look at the query now. You can see it returns back a list of maps now. Okay, so it's a list of maps. And because username is unique, we know that we will actually only get back one specific value inside of that list. So it's a list of size 1. So let's just go and test if the maps that we got back from the database, if that maps dot is not empty, then we know we've got that user exists, and we will be returning user dot, and you will remember there's the from JSON now. So remember this one returns back a list of map string object, and that's exactly what we have here. We will be passing in that list map string object using this from JSON, and this will convert it back to a user object for me. Okay, so we will be returning, and now it will be that maps dot, and we can just use first there. So in this case, maps dot first will be the only value that we get returning because we know username is unique. So the first one, which is also the only one, is the one that we will be converting, and we're getting back that user. Right, and then the else part here, if that is empty, we can actually maybe force an exception to occur. So I'm going to just say force an exception, throw exception, and we'll have our own message here that says this username not found in the database. So later on we can have a try and a catch block, and if we catch this exception, we can show this to the user, not found in the database. Okay, so what we did in the get user was to open up the database. We query using the user table, using these columns, where the username is equal to the username that was passed in. If the map is not empty, we know we've got that user, and we call the from JSON to get the first element, which is also the only one, and we convert that to a user object to return back. And then the else will be forcing the exception to occur. Right, and that is that for the get user part. Now let's say we want to get all the users. We don't only want to get one user there. So we're going to do the same sort of thing again. We will get a future. In this case, it will be a list of user objects. And we're going to call this one get all users. Now I'm not going to use this in the app at all, but just to show you how that you can also get a list of everything there. So let's get the list of all the users. So I'm going to have a final database again, will be this await, and it's going to be instance.database again, just like we had there, exactly the same thing. And again, we're going to say final. We can call this result. You can call it maps again, whatever you want. And we're going to say await database.query again. So we want to query which table. So we're going to get into that now. So the table again, like we did there, will be the user table. And if we only say user table there, we will actually get everything because we're querying the user table, and in the user table, it contains all of the users. So by just doing this, we're getting back everything. So what we can also then do is to just maybe say, let's order all the users by a specific value. So for example, we can go then to, let's say, the user fields dot, let's order it by the username. And then we can also go and say, do we want to have it ascending or descending? Sorry, this must be a string. Okay, so that's a string, and ascending is ASC, ascending is the default value. So you can also go and say DESC for descending if you wanted to. I'm just going to keep it as ascending. Okay, and that is basically it. And that will get me back the result. And that result, you can see, is a list of map values. And that every map there is actually a new user object. Okay, so now how do we translate that back again? So the same as we did here, we said return that from JSON maps.first. The same type of thing we need to call user.fromJSON. Okay, so we can say that just something like return result.map. And what we can do here is to go and say user.fromJSON, passing in that e value, and we're going to call .toList. Okay, so what is this line doing now? So using this map function, it will actually help me to run through all of the items in this result, which is a list of maps. And for every item in this list of maps, it will convert that map to a JSON file for me and then put it into a list. And I'll get back a list of user objects. Right, great stuff. We'll not be using get all users at all here, but that's just how you will get all the users if you wanted to. Okay, so let's go to the next one. We will have a future integer for this one, and this one will be update user. Okay, so far we've done the create and the read, getting one user or getting all users. Now, update and delete still remains. So we're going to use update user there. And for the update user, we'll get back a user object, or we send through a user object, and we want to update that user now. So again, we will have final db equals await instance.database, and then we can just be returning that database instance dot update. Okay, so for update again, you will see that we need a table and we need to specify the values that we want to update. Okay, so for this update, I'm going to use the user table again. I'm going to update the user table. I'm going to take this user and I'm going to convert it to a JSON file. So that's the second argument. So the first argument is the table and then the values that you want to update. So it's that user converted to a map. And then we can use the where clause. And what I want to do here is to say, well, I want to update the database where the user fields dot username is in fact going to the user at the top dot username. So this user that was passed in, we convert to a JSON file there or to a map. So we send it to the database. So remember, for update, table first, second argument is the value. So this is the value I want to update, is converting this user object now to a map where the username column is equal to the username that was passing. So it's the user's username. Okay, so in this case, we are then updating a specific record inside of user table. This is the record we're updating, where the username in the table is equal to this username that we pass through of this user. Right, let's go to the next one. So now we can delete the user. So let's go to future. I'm going to get back an integer again. So what is this integer that was passed through? So if you hover over update there, just remove this quickly. If you hover over update user there, sorry, this one, update, you will see it returns back an int convenience method for updating rows and returns the number of changes made. So we're not really using it, but just getting back a value there. So the same here, we're going to get back a future int there, and we're going to call it delete user. Now for this delete user, we will have a string username to actually delete. We will have an asynchronous function there to delete this user. We will have that final db equals await instance.database, and then we just return the delete function. So we're going to say db.delete, and you can see first thing we need to indicate there again is the table. So which table do we want to delete? If you hover over it, we need the table name and then the where clause. Okay, so the table name is the user table again. The where clause will be where the user field's username is equal to, and then let's use the where arguments again, the username that was passed in. Okay, so this username that was passed in, where the username in the table called user table is equal to this username that was passed in, that's the one we want to delete. And we are returning back, the delete will return back, it's a convenience method for deleting rows in the database, and it will return the number of rows affected. So how many rows did you delete is that integer that will be returned. Okay, and that is then it for the users. Okay, so this video is getting long, but we need to finish it. Right, only 4 functions left. Okay, so the next one, let's go into the to-do table now. So we've done all the users CRUD operations. So we're creating a user, we're getting back one user, getting back all the users, updating the user, and deleting the user. So let's see how we can do the to-dos now. So for the to-dos, we're going to get back a to-do here, and it will just be the one that we're creating, like we did for the user. So you can see there for the create user, we also got back the user we created. Okay, so we're going to say create to-do, and we want to pass in a new to-do that we want to insert into the database. Again, it's going to be an asynchronous function like we had at the top. It will be final db equals await instance.database again, just to get a connection to the database. And we're going to call await db.insert. Again, we're going to go to the to-do table this time, and the values will be using that JSON. Okay, so the values that we want to pass in is this to-do dot to JSON. Okay, so you will see for the insert then, we need a table and we need the values. And you can also have these conflict algorithms and so forth that you can go and read about. So the table and the values that we want to insert. So remember, as part of this to-do, we also have this to JSON that converts it to a map to send to the database and get it back from the database as a map converted back to a to-do. Okay, so in this case, we are sending it to the database, so we're using the to JSON there. We're converting it to a map. Right, and then we can just basically return back that to-do that was passed in to show that everything went fine. So we will use this also in a try-catch so that if something goes wrong, then we catch that error. Okay, so that's create to-do. Now the next thing we're going to do here is for updating a to-do. We will not be updating the title or the date or anything else, but only this one value. So if you look at the app, when we check it off, that Boolean value is the only value that we wanted to change. So I'm not going to call this one update. I'm going to call this one toggle to do done or something like that. So let's create a future. It will just tell me how many values I actually updated, which should always be 1. And we're just going to say toggle to do done. So I want to toggle this value. That's the only value I want to change for it to do. Okay, so I'm going to pass in the to do object that I want to change, or I want to toggle. Okay, again, I'm going to go to final db equals await instance.database, getting an instance of the database. Now let's just go to this to do and we change it. So we're going to go to do.done should become not to do.done. So I'm just toggling it. If the value was previously true, then not true will now become false. And if it was previously false, not false will become true. So I'm just toggling the value. It's like switching it on or switching it off. Just changing the value from true to false or from false to true. And then I'm going to send through that as an update. So I'm going to say return, go to the database, use the update. What do I want to update now? Now, again, we need to specify a few values there. So if you hover over update, it needs a table and the values with the where clause. Okay, so in this case, the table will be the to-do table. The value will be that to-do dot to JSON. So we're converting it to a map and then sending it through the database. And we want to update where. Now this where clause will be a bit bigger, because we want to make sure that we update for the correct user as well as for the correct title. Okay, so we're going to say where this to-do fields dot username, or let's start off with the title first, where the title is equal to something, and at the same time, the to-do fields dot username is also equal to something. Okay, just put a comma there at the end again. Right, and then we will need our where arguments, and we've got 2 question marks now there. So where the title is equal to the first question mark, so where the title is to-do.title, the to-do that was passed in, where the title is equal to the one that was passed in, and the username is equal to this to-do.username. Right, so that's how you use the 2 question marks. So separated by commas in the where arguments. Then you're making sure that there's no SQL injection. Okay, 2 functions left. So we've got the create to do, we've got the create, we've got the update. Now let's see if we can get all of the to-dos, because we need to get all of the to-dos to show them here. So that is create, update. Now read and delete still remains. So let's get this one, the read one. So we're going to say future. We want to get back a list of to-do objects, and we're going to call it get to-dos. Now, we want to get all the to-dos for a specific username, and we're going to use async there. Okay, so you will see in this example also, we've got John's to-do list. So it's linked to a specific username here. So then we pass in the username and we get the to-dos for the specific user. For example, you will type your username here, and when you click on continue, we can then get the to-dos for that specific username and list them here. Okay, so that's the idea behind this one. So get the to-dos, again, final database equals await instance database. Right, let's call this one a result equals await. Go to the database, query the database again, and then there's a few things that we need to set. Okay, so for this query again, you remember we need a table. That's the first argument. So let's get the table. This is the to-do table. And then we can set a few things now. So we can order by, basically we want to get everything. So if you look at the get user that we did, get all users, we only need to specify the user table, and then we can order it by something. So we'll do exactly the same thing. We get everything by just saying to-do table, but let's order it. So we can either order it by title or we can order it by the date. So probably the date is better, but it depends on what you want to do here. So I'm going to use the order by, and I'm going to use the to-do fields, and I'm going to order it by that date that it was created, because I think this will make sense most in the sequence that you added. Maybe we want to have this descending. So the newest ones will be at the top. Okay, and then we can have a where clause there, but you can also have ordered it by, let's say, the title, and then you will have it alphabetically sorted there. Okay, so the where clause there then, very important where clause this, because we want to check for this specific username. Okay, so we want to get everything where the username is this username that was passed in. So we're going to go to where the to-do fields dot username is in fact going to the where arguments, this username that was passed in. Right, so then we get only the to-dos for that specific user. Then the same that we did there, we will be returning this type of map. So I'm just going to copy that line there. So it's the same type of thing that we will be doing here, is we will be returning that result.map. E is in fact that map, and we're going to say user, not user this time, to-do dot from JSON, and converting every element in this map. So this query returns back a list of maps, and that maps will be converted using from JSON to a to-do, and then it will be placed in a list, and that's the list we get back. Right, then the last function for this video, and that is future. Let's use int again, just to get the number of values that we actually will be deleting, and we're going to call delete to do. So yes, we will be using delete to do because we need to delete it when we swipe. Okay, so we're going to say delete to do. Which to do? Well, let's pass it in, the one that you want to delete. It's going to be asynchronous. Final database equals await instance.database again. And now we can just delete it. So we're going to say return database.delete. And we need to delete from a specific table. So if you look at delete, you want to specify the table and with a where clause. Okay, so in this case, we want to go and say, go to the to-do table and delete where to-do. Let's just go do this again. To-do fields dot title. So where the title is equal to something, and that title also belongs to the same username. So we will also have the user connected to this. So we will go to to-do fields dot username equals something. Okay, so we're going to delete this to-do item for this specific user. So the to-do item with the title bread, that's connected to John. Okay, so if you understand that part. So we're going to say where arguments there. So in this case, we want to go and say where the title is equal to the title of this object. So it's going to be to-do.title. And the username is equal to this object's username. So it's going to be to-do.username. Right, and this was a mouthful of a video, but we've created a nice to-do database now with the onConfigure, the close, the getting the database, creating a new user, getting the user, getting all users, updating a user, deleting a user, create a to-do, toggle the to-do done, getting all the to-dos, and deleting the to-dos. So I know this is a mouthful, and normally when you get these type of videos, it's only with one table. So yes, it's a bit bigger because we are using more than one table, but I think it's adding a lot of content for you to be able to know how it works, also working with more than one table. Thanks very much for watching this video. In the next video, we will be looking at these two files, the user service and the to-do service. And these two files, maybe we'll do one per video, but these two files will then be your provider, and how provider will help us to use the functions we did in the to-do database in order to make it a bit easier before we get to the actual user interface. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.